It was a Friday evening, and the office was unusually quiet. Most employees had already left for the weekend, leaving the floor eerily silent. Samantha, a junior accountant, was one of the few left behind. She had a strict deadline to meet and couldn't afford to leave work unfinished. As she typed away at her desk, the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional clicking of her keyboard were the only sounds accompanying her. The office itself had always felt sterile and impersonal. Rows of identical cubicles stretched across the room, each with its own lifeless charm. Samantha's cubicle was near the corner, close to the emergency stairwell, a place no one used unless there was a fire drill. Beyond her desk, the floor extended into dimly lit hallways and unused meeting rooms that now seemed to breathe with a faint, unsettling hum. Around 7:30 p.m., Samantha felt it for the first time, the sensation that someone was watching her. She paused her work, glancing over her shoulder. The open-plan office was empty, the fluorescent lights above flickering occasionally. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of her focus. Half an hour later, Samantha decided to take a break. She grabbed her coffee mug and walked to the pantry. The corridor leading to it was dimmer than usual, with only half the lights functioning. As she passed the small conference room, she thought she saw movement inside. Just a shadow darting from one end of the room to the other. She froze. The room was supposed to be locked. Taking a deep breath, Samantha pushed the thought aside and continued to the pantry. She placed her mug under the coffee machine, but as the warm liquid poured in, she felt a cold draft brush against her neck. She turned around quickly, expecting to see someone, but no one was there. The pantry door, however, which had been closed when she entered, was now slightly ajar. Returning to her desk, she found her computer screen had gone black. She pressed a few keys, and the screen lit up again, displaying her documents just as she'd left them. But something was different. A new file had appeared on her desktop. A document she hadn't created. Its name sent a chill down her spine. "I see you." Samantha stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The lights in her cubicle flickered, and she heard a faint whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking her name from far away. She quickly looked around, but again, there was no one there. Suddenly, from the direction of the stairwell behind her, she heard the creak of a door opening. A cold wave of dread washed over her as she realized she wasn't as alone as she thought. This segment sets up a chilling, suspenseful atmosphere, establishing Samantha's growing paranoia and the unexplained phenomena around her. It leaves room for escalation in the next segments, while hooking the audience with its unsettling details. Samantha's breath quickened as the sound of the stairwell door echoed through the silent office. It wasn't loud, but in the eerie stillness, it felt deafening. She turned her chair slowly toward the emergency stairwell behind her cubicle, her eyes locked on the door. It was slightly ajar, swinging lazily as if someone had just walked through it. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. She immediately regretted speaking, the sound of her voice making the silence that followed feel even more oppressive. No response. She stood up cautiously, every nerve in her body screaming at her to leave. But curiosity and the need to reassure herself compelled her to investigate. Samantha grabbed her phone from the desk. its weak flashlight offering little comfort, and walked toward the stairwell. Each step felt heavier, as though an unseen force was weighing her down. The stairwell door creaked open fully as she approached, revealing a dark, empty space. The narrow staircase spiraled upward and downward, shrouded in shadows. Samantha shone her phone's flashlight into the void, illuminating nothing but the concrete walls and metal railings. There was no one there. Just as she was about to retreat, she heard it. A faint, almost inaudible sound. A whisper. It was too soft to make out the words, but it was unmistakably real. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, her instincts finally screaming at her to leave the building. But as she turned to head back to her desk, she froze. Her computer screen was glowing again, but the desktop had changed. The file named I See You was gone, replaced by a new one. Look behind you. Samantha's blood ran cold. She couldn't bring herself to turn around immediately. Instead, she stood rooted to the office floor was empty, just as it had been moments ago. But something felt off. The air was heavier, charged with an oppressive energy. The lights overhead flickered again, and in the brief darkness she saw of it. A shadow moving across the far end of the room near the printer station. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. No answer. The shadow was gone. She rushed back to her desk, grabbing her bag and laptop. "I'm done with this," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. As she unplugged her laptop, she noticed something else on her desk. A piece of paper that hadn't been there before. It was a torn page, old and yellowed, with a single word scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. Help. Panic surged through her. She didn't remember hearing anyone enter the office, and the cameras at the entrance required every employee to swipe their ID. She wasn't just dealing with a prank or a coincidence. This was something else entirely. As she stuffed the paper into her bag and hurried toward the elevators, the lights in the hallway began to shut off one by one, as though someone or something was following her. She broke into a sprint, slamming the elevator button repeatedly. Come on," she whispered desperately. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened with agonizing slowness. She stepped inside and hit the ground floor button. Just as the doors began to close, she heard the whisper again, louder this time, right outside the elevator. "Samantha." She gasped, spinning around, but the door shut before she could see anything. Her reflection in the polished steel walls of the elevator stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. For a moment, she thought it was over, that she was finally safe. But then, the elevator jolted violently, coming to a sudden stop between floors. The lights flickered off, plunging her into darkness. Samantha screamed, fumbling for her phone. She turned on the flashlight, illuminating the confined space. The emergency button didn't work. The air felt colder, heavier. And then she saw it on the elevator doors. Claw-like scratches began to appear, as if invisible hands were carving into the metal. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a notification, a new email. With trembling hands, she opened it. The sender's name was unknown, and the subject line read, "You can't leave." Before she could process what was happening, the elevator lights came back on. The doors opened slowly, not to the ground floor, but to the dark, deserted office she had just left. The same shadow stood in the distance, its outline clearer now. It wasn't a person. It was taller, distorted, its limbs unnaturally long. Samantha couldn't move, couldn't scream, as it began to walk toward her. And then, the lights went out again. This segment builds tension and introduces escalating supernatural elements, leaving Samantha trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. The vivid descriptions and suspense keep the audience hooked, while the unexplained phenomena set the stage for an intense climax. The darkness in the elevator was suffocating. Samantha's breathing was shallow as she fumbled with her phone, its flashlight barely illuminating her trembling hands. The sound of her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but beneath it, she heard something else, a rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the open elevator doors. "Is someone there?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Her voice wavered, the words swallowed by the oppressive silence. Summoning the last shred of her courage, Samantha stepped out of the elevator. The office was unrecognizable now. The fluorescent lights had dimmed to an eerie, flickering glow, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air felt thicker, colder, and carried the faint scent of mildew and something metallic, like blood. The shadowy figure she had seen earlier was gone, but its presence lingered, as if it was watching her from the void. Samantha clutched her phone tightly, the light sweeping across the rows of cubicles. She tried to retrace her steps toward the main entrance, but the layout of the office seemed to have changed. Hallways stretched endlessly, looping back to where she started, trapping her in a labyrinth of her own workplace. Her phone buzzed again, a new notification. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was another email from unknown. This time, it had an attachment. The subject line read, "The truth." Samantha hesitated, then tapped on the attachment. It was a photograph, a grainy black and white image of a young woman sitting at a desk. The woman looked eerily familiar. Samantha squinted at the screen, and then her stomach dropped. The woman in the photograph was her. Except, "That's not possible," Samantha whispered. She hadn't even joined the company until last year. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the image. Who had taken it? Why was it here? Suddenly a sharp noise broke her thoughts. A chair scraping against the floor. She spun around, shining her flashlight toward the sound. Sitting in her cubicle, staring blankly at the computer screen, was the same woman from the photograph. The woman didn't move, didn't blink, as though frozen in time. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she slowly approached. Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. The figure finally turned to face her, and Samantha recoiled in horror. The woman's face was her own, but pale and lifeless, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. Before Samantha could scream, the lights flickered violently, and the room began to shift around her. The walls twisted and groaned, and the office dissolved into an endless expanse of darkness. The shadowy figure reappeared, towering over her, its grotesque limbs reaching out. A voice echoed in her mind, low and distorted. "You were never supposed to leave." In an instant, Samantha was pulled into the void, the oppressive darkness swallowing her whole. The next morning, the office floor was bustling again. Employees chatted over coffee, unaware of the events that had unfolded the night before. Samantha's desk, however, remained untouched, her belongings neatly arranged as though she had never been there. Later that day, a junior employee noticed something odd. On Samantha's computer, a file was open, a document titled "Help." But when they tried to open it, the screen flickered and the file disappeared. And somewhere, deep in the labyrinth of the office, A faint whisper lingered. I see you. This final segment delivers a chilling climax and a haunting twist, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of unease. Samantha's fate ties into the office's mysterious past, suggesting a cycle of horror that repeats endlessly. The clock ticked steadily as the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the quiet office. It was nearly 8 p.m., and everyone else had left hours ago. Emily, a 27-year-old data analyst, was the only one still at her desk, typing furiously to meet a looming deadline. The office, usually bustling with chatter and ringing phones, was eerily silent. The kind of silence that felt heavy, like it had a presence of its own. Emily had been working at Vanguard Tech Solutions for 3 years. It was a mid-sized company with a sleek, modern office space, a far cry from her small-town upbringing. While the company was successful, Emily had always felt there was something off about the place. Her co-workers often whispered about strange occurrences, files disappearing, computers turning on by themselves, and a lingering shadow in the break room. Emily dismissed it as office gossip, but tonight, alone and under the dim lights, the stories started to creep into her thoughts. She glanced at the clock again. 8:07 p.m. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she rubbed her tired eyes. That's when she noticed something odd. The air felt colder. Not the type of chill from the office AC, but a bone-deep cold that made her shiver. She shook it off, reasoning it was just exhaustion. As she reached for her coffee cup, a soft click echoed from the far end of the office. Emily froze. It sounded like the door to the archives room. A room no one had any reason to use at this hour. She stared down the dimly lit hallway, her heart beating faster. Probably just the cleaning crew, she muttered under her breath, though deep down she knew the cleaners didn't come until 9. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus on her work. But as she looked back at her screen, she saw her reflection in the blackened monitor. Behind her chair, in the faint glow of the emergency exit light, there was something. A shadow. Tall and unmoving. Emily whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty rows of desks. The cold intensified, wrapping around her like a fog. She shook her head, laughing nervously to herself. I'm imagining things. But was she? Emily tried to brush off the uneasiness, focusing back on her screen, but her hands trembled slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. The shadow she thought she'd seen. It wasn't just her imagination. Or was it? She saved her work and decided to check her emails. The familiar routine would calm her nerves, she thought. But as she opened her inbox, something strange caught her eye. There was a new email sitting at the top of the list. The subject line read, "Do not stay late." Her heart skipped a beat. She clicked on it, only to find the body of the email empty. No sender, no timestamp, nothing. She blinked, staring at the screen, her pulse quickening. Was someone playing a prank? She scrolled down, but the email vanished before her eyes, as if it had never been there. A chill ran down her spine. Emily stood up and walked to the window, needing to break away from the screen. She looked out at the city below, its lights twinkling against the dark sky. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and uneasy. That's when she noticed something peculiar. There was movement in the reflection. A desk behind her, one she knew was empty, had a chair slowly spinning, as though someone had just gotten up from it. Her breath hitched. She turned quickly, but the chair was completely still. The office was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. "I'm just tired," she told herself again, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her disbelief. Determined to prove there was nothing wrong, Emily decided to walk around the office. She needed to check the archives room. After all, she'd heard the door earlier. She grabbed her phone, turning on its flashlight as she made her way down the dim hallway. The closer she got, the colder the air became. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. When she reached the door, she hesitated. It was slightly ajar, though she was sure it had been closed earlier. Pushing the door open with a creak, Emily shone her flashlight inside. The small room was packed with old file cabinets and dusty shelves. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then her flashlight flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Emily." Her flashlight steadied, but she felt rooted to the spot, her heart hammering in her chest. Someone, or something, knew her name. She scanned the room, her light catching the edge of a filing cabinet. That's when she saw it. A set of footprints in the dust on the floor, leading deeper into the room. They were fresh, and they didn't belong to her. Emily's pulse raced as she stared at the footprints in the dust. They led deeper into the archives room, toward the far corner, where the overhead light barely reached. Her flashlight flickered again, the weak beam dancing along the rows of filing cabinets. The air was heavier now, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was alive and watching her. Taking a hesitant step forward, she whispered to herself, "It's just an old building, nothing more." But her voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. As she followed the footprints, she noticed something strange. They didn't look human. The shape was irregular, almost claw-like, and the gait was unnatural, as if whatever made them had been dragging its weight across the floor. Emily's legs felt weak, but her curiosity, or was it fear, pushed her onward. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her hand, nearly making her drop it. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message or a call, but it was only the lock screen. A notification from an unknown app she didn't remember installing. The message read, "Turn around." Her breath hitched. Slowly she turned her head, the flashlight trembling in her grasp. Behind her, the door to the archives room was now shut tight. She hadn't heard it close, and then she saw to it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, emerged from between the Emily's legs burned as she descended the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. The darkness above her was alive, swallowing the lights one by one, creeping closer with each passing second. The growl echoed again, this time louder, reverberating through the stairwell like a predator closing in on its prey. Her breath hitched as she reached the landing for the ground floor. The exit door stood in front of her, but something was wrong. The emergency sign above it flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The door itself looked warped, the edges bending inward as if being pulled by an unseen force. She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, but the sound of something heavy moving in the stairwell above shattered her thoughts. A loud thud followed by scraping, as if something massive and clawed was descending after her. Gripping the door handle, Emily yanked it open and stumbled into the lobby. But the lobby was unrecognizable. The once modern space was now bathed in a sickly green hue. the furniture twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, making it hard to breathe. As she moved toward the main entrance, her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space was far larger than it appeared. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt worse. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't dare look at it. She knew by now that whatever was happening wasn't normal, and wasn't something she wanted to understand. Just as her fingers brushed the glass door leading outside, a deafening slam came from behind her. She spun around, her heart dropping into her stomach. The shadow was there, fully formed now, towering and solid. Its shape was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Its face was a void, but within the blackness, two faint pinpoints of light burned like distant stars. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The creature tilted its head, as if studying her, and then it spoke. Its voice was a cacophony, layers of whispers and screams all at once. "You've seen too much." Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her back pressing against the glass door. She fumbled for her phone, desperate for some kind of light or distraction, but the screen glitched and flickered, displaying a single word over and over. "Stay." The creature moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The lights in the lobby began to dim, one by one, until the only illumination came from the faint glow of its eyes. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt constricted, as though the air itself had turned against her. Summoning every ounce of strength, she grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the shadow. It passed through the creature harmlessly, the chair clattering to the floor. The shadow didn't flinch, but its head tilted further, almost mockingly. Then it lunged. Emily barely rolled out of the way, the creature's claws slicing through the glass door behind her, as if it were paper. Shards rained down around her as she scrambled to her feet, bolting toward the elevators. The stairs weren't an option. Whatever it was had come from there. The elevator doors miraculously opened just as she reached them, and she threw herself inside, slamming the close button repeatedly. The creature stood at the end of the hallway, motionless, watching her as the doors slid shut. For a moment, she thought she was safe, but as the elevator began to ascend, the lights inside flickered. A low growl echoed through the small space, and she realized too late. The creature was inside with her. It appeared in the corner, its shadowy form stretching impossibly large, filling the elevator. Emily pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The creature leaned closer, its featureless face inches from hers. It whispered one final word, its voice like the dying breath of a storm. "Mine." The elevator screeched to a halt, and the lights went out completely. Emily's scream was the last sound to echo in the suffocating darkness.